let's move on to Dr. Femi Omotoyinbo. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He will be he's from the Queen's University in Belfast, and his presentation is entitled Reparation and Unjust Non-Combatants in War. So, Femi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much, Shumut. Can you hear me very well?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, let me just share my screen. Thank you. So my presentation is on reparation and unjust non-combatants in war. So my key claim is that instead of allowing non-combatants that contribute to unjust war, instead of allowing them to go scot-free, there should be a grant to grant liability for reparation. In other words, they should be liable for reparation instead of just going scot-free. And I'll be using some principles from tort law to develop that liability, particularly in the context of the arms industry. So the outline of my presentation, I will first be looking into excusing conditions that are used to argue against the liability of unjust non-combatants to harm. And I will be arguing against those excusing conditions. And next, I will be looking into the liability for reparation. And then I'll be using tort law as a principle to design that liability. Then the next thing I will do is just to look into two supports or two moral reasons, two moral grants for granting that liability for reparation. Then the question and answer. By the way, the picture here is just one of the developments in Afghanistan, where we have lots of Afghans at Kabul airport waiting to be removed from the country, either to the United States or to any part of the world. A majority of these people, they are non-combatants, they are civilians, and some of them are interpreters. If they remain in Afghanistan, they'll be attacked by the Taliban. And that is why they wanted to remove them from the country. United States and many other countries wanted to remove these individuals from the country. And by the way, these guys, they are not combatants. They are non-combatants. They are civilians. But this is just to show that non-combatants have lots of significance in their contribution to war. And I will be using this to argue against the notion that non-combatants' contribution to war are not so significant. And that is one of the reasons why some theories believe, oh, we should just excuse them, we can go. But I will first look into those theories, into those arguments about excusing non-combatants. So the first point is that if we attack non-combatants, there's a likelihood of breaching the principle of non-combatant immunity. And the principle of non-combatant immunity in just war theory, in war, is that only combatants are liable to attack. Non-combatants are not liable to attack because they are just innocent civilians. They don't have any contribution to war. For example, if you look at the picture there, we have a non-combatant, full-fledged non-combatant that is folding his arms, is not contributing to the war at all. Then we have this combatant with weapon. So, and in between them, we have a combatant, a non-combatant that is participating in war. Another one that is also is participating in war and is also not participating in war at the same time. So people believe if we attack these people, the guy with a partial participation in the war, there's a likelihood for us to also attack those people that are not participating in war at all. That is leading to the notion of proportionality. Like we cannot attack non-combatants that are participating in war without attacking those that are not participating at all. So the best thing is just to leave all of them. Let's leave them. And the second point for this excusing condition is that the contributions of non-combatants in war are insignificant. For example, compared to a soldier that is firing weapon, the action or the activity of pulling the trigger is tantamount to killing somebody compared to maybe an interpreter that is just interpreting. The fact that somebody is interpreting does not really cause any death at all or cause any harm. So their contribution, they consider it as insignificant. Instead of focusing on those that are making insignificant contribution, we should rather focus on people that are making significant contribution. That is the argument of this theorist. And I'll be arguing against this argument. I'm using 2 points. First is that if non-combatants that are contributing to unjust war, if we leave them, if we allow them to go scot-free, that is going to be unjust on the part of those that are not contributing to war at all. Because those that are not contributing to war at all, they deserve the peace, they deserve the immunity, they deserve the protection that they have because they don't contribute at all. So it is wrong for us to allow people that are contributing to unjust war to enjoy the same peace, to enjoy the same humanity, like those that are contributing, like those that are not contributing to war. So that's my first point. And the second point is that there's always a need to repair wrongdoing in war. There's always a need to repair wrongdoing in war. War is totally devastating. There's killing, there's maiming, there's destruction of lives and properties. And we cannot just leave victims of war, victims of unjust war, to just suffer like that. There's always a grant to correct that wrongdoing. And I'll be using the position of Larry May. Larry May says there's an obligation for those who have suffered damages to receive reparation in all cases where practically possible. So there's an obligation, and we cannot just leave them alone like that. But one other point is that most times, either politicians or policymakers or combatants in war, it is very difficult to lay hold on them to be liable for reparation. It's very difficult to lay on them to be responsible for what they've done in war. For example, it is very difficult to lay hold on maybe the United States, the United Kingdom, and some other nations that participated in Afghanistan war. It is very difficult to pinpoint any one of them to say, oh, you should be responsible for the victims. But in that case, where it's so difficult to identify combatants or policymakers, then why don't we just pinpoint those that are contributing to war, or those that have they've made a lot of money from that war, particularly the arms industry. So that is my point. It is not good to allow the wrongdoing to be uncorrected. We should try to correct them. Those are my 2 points. And that will be leading us into the notion of reparation. In other words, I think non-combatants that are contributing to unjust war should be liable to reparation. And by the way, I'm focusing on the arms industry. The arms industry, people that are working in the arms industry, or the arms industry as a collective entity. And by reparation, I mean moral repair. Moral repair, that is to achieve an equilibrium or a balance between the victim and the wrongdoer. Because whenever there's a wrongdoing in any sector, whether in war or outside war, there's an imbalance between the victim and the wrongdoer. So reparation on this note is to restore that balance, to create an equilibrium between the victim and the wrongdoer. And I'm thinking we can borrow some principles in tort law. We can apply them to creating that liability in the context of non-combatants, particularly the arms industry. And the 3 principles I'll be borrowing here. Before I go into the 3 principles, I just, for the sake of those that may not know much about tort law, what I mean by tort law is just legal views about wrongdoings or breach of human rights generally. So I'll be applying some principles, and the first one I'll be applying here is for us to grant liability for reparation, the first thing that we must ascertain is that there is a duty of care. That's the first one. And 2, that there is a breach of that duty. And 3, that the breach results in a damage or injury or harm to innocent individuals. When we can ascertain these 3 points, these 3 elements, then we can have a grant to grant liability for reparation. And going back to the notion of duty of care, what I mean by duty of care is what we can identify it's a kind of social, legal, or moral relationship between individuals in a society. It can be a relationship between the driver and the passenger. It can be a relationship between the landlord and the tenants. It can be a relationship between maybe a company and the employees. So there's a duty of care. In as much as these people are working on you, there's a moral base on which they relate. And because of that, people that are employed, for example, let's take the example of a landlord. A landlord is having a house and is having tenants in that building. The tenants in that building, they are under the auspices of the landlord. So the landlord is having a duty of care for those tenants. So, for example, he is having an obligation to make sure that the house is habitable, that everything in the house is okay, so that the tenants can live there peacefully. If, for example, let's say there's part of the building that is leaking, water is just rushing in, that is a breach of that duty. And the landlord is aware of it. It's just like, I don't care. I've collected my money anyway. So that is a breach of that duty. And let's imagine that when the water enters into the building, the water destroys certain properties inside the building. That's the breach is causing a damage. And whenever the breach is causing a damage, we're having the third grant, so we can grant liability for reparation. So I'll be using this in the context of the arms industry. And before I go there, I must mention there's a difficulty here in the context of the arms industry when we're talking about duty of care, because people that are making weapons, when I talk about the arms industry, I'm talking about people that are making weapons or sometimes supplying the weapons. So the duty of care that they have is not very obvious, unlike when we're talking about combatants. For example, if I'm working with an arms industry, let's say a big system or maybe a BA system, if I'm working with them or I'm the one in charge of the company, the fact that I'm producing weapons and I'm supplying these weapons to the war front does not make anybody dead. Nobody's going to die because I'm supplying weapons. Death or harm or wrongdoing will only occur when some people will take the weapon and use them against the individuals or the victims. So we can say, oh, it is so difficult to develop a kind of duty of care between non-combatants, that is the munition workers or the company itself, and the victims, because there's lack of proximity. There's remoteness in between the two of them. So this is one of the difficulties concerning the duty of care for the arms industry. But my response to this is that we can develop a duty of care on the basis of the nature of what they produce. Weapons are intrinsically dangerous. We don't design weapons so we can use them for decorations. We design weapons to kill. Every bullet is having a potential to kill. So in as much as the products are very dangerous, people that are making those products, they're having a responsibility to ensure proper ethical use of their products. That is a duty of care. In other words, they're having a duty of care to almost everybody, because anybody can be a potential victim. Anybody can be killed. We are not having metal bodies that bullets cannot enter. We are all potential victims of any misuse of weapons. So there's a duty of care there on that mission. And this duty of care entails making sure that only responsible individuals are having access to the weapons. That is one. Two, making sure that those that are having access to these weapons, they are people that are having ethical track records. People that you can verify that they don't have any history of misuse of weapons. So those are the kind of people that we can say, okay, yeah, we can sell our weapons to them. So the arms industry is having a duty of care to verify the historical background of those that are purchasing the weapons. So you don't just allow anyone to have access to your weapons. So this may be leading us to query the situation now in Afghanistan, where the United States military or the armies, they just left the weapons there in Afghanistan, in Kabul, to the mercy of anybody. Anybody can just pick the weapons, and the Taliban, they're just using the weapons. That is unjust. So they have a duty of care. People that are supplying the weapons, the BA system, the Boeing or Thales or any of those companies, they have a responsibility to make sure that their weapons are not accessible to irresponsible individuals. And even in Africa, there are some cases of responsible entities acquiring weapons. They acquire weapons, but they cannot protect their weapons. They cannot keep them. So you have terrorists attacking military bases and taking away stockpiles of weapons. So the arms industry is having a duty of care to ensure that people that are purchasing the weapon, they are the ones that can really keep and maintain an ethical use of their products. They are not just ones that we keep them in a shop or in the store, and some people can just come in anytime and take them away. That is a duty of care. And if they breach any one of this duty, maybe, for example, they just, because they want to make money, they just sell their weapons, you can come. For example, I'm so sorry to use this example. For example, maybe the BA system in the UK just selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. Oh, come because you have the money, and Saudi Arabia can use the weapon to attack innocent civilians in Yemen. That is a breach of that duty. And when there's a breach of that duty, And we can see on our screen day in, day out, how innocent civilians are victims of this misuse of these weapons. When there's a breach of that duty and the breach is resulting in damages, in harm to innocent individuals, we have a grant for reparation. That is my main argument. And like I said, I think I need to mention this again, that this is a work in progress, and I will value your thoughts and your suggestions concerning this, but this is like a key part of what I'm trying to say, that instead of allowing non-combatants, unjust non-combatants, and by unjust non-combatants, I mean people that are contributing to unjust war, instead of allowing them to go scot-free and say, because they are protected under the umbrella of non-combatant immunity, principle of non-combatant immunity, instead of allowing them to go scot-free, we can make them liable for reparation. And one other thought that I'll be considering is, I have two reasons to argue in support of this liability for reparation. But before I go there, I just want to consider another example in the case of Saudi Arabia. You know, we have Saudi Arabia, they've been taking, I don't know, maybe people are aware of this situation. There's an organization called CAT, Campaign Against Arms Trade. CAT took the BA system and the British government to court that they should stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. But they continued. They continued on the basis that they've signed a contract, and we must fill our hand. We must make sure we satisfy them and supply the weapons. But we can. It's just very unpalatable. Like, it's pathetic that some people are making money from unjust deeds. They are making money. People are dying every day because of the misuse of weapons. And when we want to talk about, okay, let's take care of the victims, we say, oh, we don't have the funds. We don't know where to get the funds. Whereas some people they're already making money from it. So why don't we seek to get the money from them? Why don't we, on the basis of liability for reparation, why don't we seek to create it, like every arms industry should include it in their, I don't know, whatever the standard they are following, that there's a duty of care to every living individual, every human being. And whenever they breach that duty, it's resulting to reparation. Some other points that I may not be able to consider in this presentation because of time and because it's just a development, it's a work in progress. One of the points is that which body will be investigating, legislating, and executing the notion of reparation? Are we just going to say, oh, we just talk about it and leave it? If we want to put it into practice, is it the United Nations that should be responsible for legislation and executing or investigating the misuse of weapons, or this framework? Which body should be doing that? And apart from that, is it likely for us to have cases where unjust non-combatants are having exclusive conditions not to be liable for reparation? Those are the points that I am yet to consider in this presentation. And hopefully, maybe when there's time for questions, we may be able to touch on those ones too. But because of time, I will just go into two major reasons. It's more or less a reiteration of what I've mentioned. Two major reasons why I am in support of liability for reparation. I've mentioned it, it's just like I'm repeating it again. One is that liability for reparation is an alternative just means of accountability. Again, instead of allowing these non-combatants that are contributing to unjust weapons, instead of allowing them to go scot-free, we can create another basis. Liability for reparation is a just and even an ethical means for accountability. And apart from that, the second point is that it's a means of correcting injustice to victims. There are lots of injustices in war fronts, and this is a basis for correcting it. Liability for reparation. There should be a grant to make this work, although these are the theoretical phase, but it's somehow ironical to be presenting something theoretical in a practical philosophy conference, but I think this thing starts like this, and I'll be very grateful for whatever comments, suggestions, and thoughts. So thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Omotoyinbo. It was a great talk, and I'm definitely sympathetic to the project. So yes, if there are any questions, comments, feel free to raise your hand, or you can ask in the chat as well. Okay, we have a lot of questions. I'm just going by the order that I see on the participant screen. So Matthew Heaney, please go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. Okay, so thanks so much for this talk. It's very thought-provoking, especially with recent events. And so I think that if we had a representative of Boeing here, that person might say, look, the responsibility for the poor things done with our products stops with the last person who bears responsibility for the act, right? And you'd want to say, well, no, there's a duty of care even for the weapons manufacturers. And I'm wondering if there are any principled constraints you could offer for where the duty of care stops, what demarcates the sort of scope of the duty of care, because without such constraints, it might be that we just go further up the supply chain, right? It's that even the materials manufacturers for the weapons bear a duty of care now for how Boeing constructs the weapons and sells them on to do the things that are unjust. So what constraints, if any, would you place to sort of define the scope of the duty of care?
Thank you so very much. I think I was considering that when I said maybe there could be excusing conditions. So I maybe before I answer your question, by constraints, do you mean excusing conditions? Is that part of it, or you just mean limitations and barriers? Or
yeah, I mean like a limitation to say the materials I take it that the materials manufacturers wouldn't bear a duty of care for what Boeing does with the materials that can go on. But then again, the materials manufacturers know what business Boeing is in. They know where their metal and wood and so on is going to end up. And so I guess this is just an intuition. We might dispute the intuition, but if we want to accept the intuition, it seems like we need some kind of criterion to decide that the lumber company doesn't bear the duty of care for what happens with the weapon, but Boeing does. And I'm wondering if there's a kind of principle that's guiding your thinking on this question.
That's true. Thank you so very much. I think I will be thinking on, like, I'm just thinking about it now, and I think it's a very thoughtful question. Thank you so much. I think I will limit the constraints to where the money goes. I don't know, maybe I'm making sense. Like, the money is moving from so buyers to so pockets. If you are earning the money, you can't make profit without responsibilities. Responsibilities are attached to profit making, although not in our world, maybe in an ideal world. People should make profits with responsibility. So I think the responsibility will be attached to the money. So wherever the money is going, the responsibility follows. If the money is going to flow downwards the chain line, the responsibility is going to go downwards the chain line too. Although this is, like I said, theoretical. We are living in a messed up world. So this majority of this is, they may not go beyond thoughts, but in an ideal world, I think responsibility should be attached to profit making. And if people that are, like you mentioned, people that are supplying the raw materials for the production of the weapons, if they are aware of the end use of their products and they're making money for it and they continue to supply the weapons, that is unjust. I remember I was talking, these are practical issues actually. I was talking with somebody and she said her dad got an employment with an arms industry. And when he noticed the track record of that industry, he was discouraged. And he said, no, I'm not going to work with them. It's not that we have few persons like that, but that should be the norm in an ideal society. I don't know, maybe I've answered your question, but the point I'm trying to make is that the constraint will be attached to the money, to the profit. Wherever the money goes, the responsibility follows. That is what I will be defending for now.
Good. So it sounds like you would just try to dispense with the intuition and make do with the excusing conditions. Like if I'm living in some cash-strapped town and I have no other economic prospects but to work for a weapons manufacturer, then maybe I'm excused. But then again, if I'm like a raw materials manufacturer and I have the option to be economically sufficient and not do business with an arms company, then I'm not excused.
That's, I mean, there was a time I was considering what you're saying because there's a likelihood for us to have non-combatants that are working in, maybe somebody is working in a munition company because they don't have any other option, an alternative place of work, or maybe they just want to make, their own view is just, I just want to make money and feed my family. I don't care about whatever they are doing with the weapon. But the point is this: the likelihood of their family members becoming victim of what they are doing is also high. It's also there. So there's a responsibility, whether we like it or not, there's a responsibility for us to consider all these things. I don't know, we can talk as much as possible on this, but thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Next, we have Aaron Gray. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed that. I think my question's along the same sort of lines, and I'm just going to push again on sort of the area around like trying to work an excuse model. I'm sort of feeling like you maybe need a criteria for who would actually be picked up by this target of reparations, like who would be responsible for the reparations. I'm thinking here, this is everything that, like, you know, so even just at the arms supply, there's people who are doing like food deliveries, there's people working in the canteen, there's people doing the admin, there's the sales guys. I'm just thinking, you know, are they all going to be responsible in that same way? What about the people that supply them? And just, I'm not sure the excusing condition is going to do the work, because there's varying degrees of involvement here, from like people who are core responsible and people who aren't at all.
Thank you so very much. I think I really love the question. So it's the same thing that Matthew was saying. And I think, I just want to write the question that I think is a very important question. But the point I want to make here is that those that are, I think this can lead us to the issue of collectivity and individualism. Like, should we base responsibility on the collective entity, the company as a collective entity, or should we consider individuals that are working in the company? And I think maybe collectivists will argue that, or some individualists will argue that people that are making contributions to the weapon, they are just, I mean, the collectivity is just a number of individual entities coming together. So if you want to blame the company, or if you want to make the company responsible for reparation, then individuals will be affected. And I think it's almost like when we are talking about a state, now we complain about the United States or maybe the United Kingdom, that they supply weapons to Saudi Arabia. And I think majority of citizens of the United Kingdom may not agree with that, may not be happy with it. But because they are part of the country, there's nothing they can do. We cannot really say they have an excuse, because we cannot really say we can make them responsible, because their belongingness to the United Kingdom is on the basis of nature. But in the context of a corporate entity, you belong to that corporate entity intentionally. You are not forced. As long as you're not forced to be part of that corporate entity, I think there's a basis for responsibility. I think so. Because one, there's the epistemic element, that you are aware of what is going on. You are aware of what they are doing with whatever they are making, and you continue to be part of it. I think on that basis, you are going to incur some responsibility. Although, like you said, I think you made a point on that, that maybe there are levels of responsibility. Maybe we can say, we cannot really think that maybe the executive members of the company, we have the same responsibility as maybe the gate man of the company. So maybe there are levels of responsibilities, and I think that's a very deep thing to consider too when we're talking about liability to reparation. But at the moment, this, like I said, this is a work in progress, and I think this is opening another door to consider. Thank you so very much, Aaron.
Okay, thank you. We have Philip Schwartz next. You may go ahead.
Thank you very much. I really liked your talk. I think you're making a principled case for a morally salient issue, and I really like that. So I've been wondering about the extent or the degree of likelihoods that needs to be considered, because it seems to me we could imagine all sorts of cases where it's really hard to to see if someone would have to be taken into responsibility, say an army just fails with their strategy and they abandon equipment. Are they responsible if the equipment falls into the hands of the insurgents or whatnot? So since it seems to me this is a sort of a philosophical legal project, so would you say it would be up to jurisdiction ultimately, or would you try to include a general framework that would allow for some criteria, and which would they be?
Sorry, I was expecting a question mark. Sorry. Anyway, that is a very important question, actually. And I'm just thinking on the spot while you're asking the question. Like, you were talking about the degree of likelihood to be considered. Maybe, I think there are two questions coming up from what you said. I think so. Because one is about whether the framework to go with this is to be philosophical or to be legal. I think there's a question on that. And the other one about the degree of likelihood. I am not sure if it's not a repetition of the same thing that Aaron and Matthew said, but I will start with the notion of philosophical and legal projects. I think maybe I would say again that in an ideal world, we may want to consider some moral grounds, but like I said, we are not living in an ideal world, and most of these things may not be applicable, but I will go with a combination of the two, like an hybrid notion of management, like combining philosophical tools and legal tools, because I think going by the history of just war theory has always been forming majority of international guidelines on warfare. So the two of them can work together simultaneously, I believe. I don't know, maybe I've answered the question well on that notion. But on the other points on degree of likelihood, I will be very grateful if you can elaborate on that, maybe briefly.
So I'm wondering which factors agents who might be responsible would have to consider would they be required to consider an extremely unlikely but still possible scenario, and could they be responsible if they didn't make provision for this scenario and it still becomes it still happens, for instance? So what exactly is the demand on, for instance, weapons manufacturers, and what exactly can they reasonably expect it to disregard because it's unlikely?
Thank you so much. I would say I think I understand the question now, but my response would be that, you know, war can be very dynamic, and contributions to war can also be dynamic as well. So I think it will be based on individual cases, that the individual cases will determine what structure or what setup will be followed to achieving that basis for reparation, for liability for reparation. I think it's going to be on individual cases because of the dynamism of war. Because if we just want to create a rigid approach to it, then even it's likely for innocent people that should be excused sometimes to become liable, and that is going to be a side effect of the whole project. So I think it's going to be depending on the war-to-war cases, depending on the nature of the war itself. I think so. Thank you so very much.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have Cian Brennan. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly.
Yeah, no, it's okay. It's Kian. Yeah.
Kian. Okay. Thank you.
Look, thanks very much for the talk. It was really interesting. I definitely share your ethical concerns. I think my question is probably along the same lines as some of the previous ones. And it was just that in the duty of care part, you talked about like a condition of having like an ethical track record for the nation or institution that an arms company might be selling to. And kind of similar to what Philip was saying there, I think, like, you know, would there be like a statute of limitations on when their responsibility stops after they've sold their products? And then also, just out of curiosity, I was thinking, is there an example of a nation or institute that has ever met that ethical track record that you have, like the idea of it that you have in your head?
Thank you so very much. Thank you. I really like the second question, but yeah, let me go with the first one. You said maybe there's going to be a point where the responsibility is going to stop. I think that's what you said. Like, yeah. For example, we can say maybe people that are selling the weapons can say, okay, we thought they are good guys and we've supplied the weapon, so we are surprised at the way they're using the weapon. Yeah, maybe that's going to be an excusing condition at that point, but that is going to create a track record for the purchasers. So next time they are coming back, you can say on the basis of the fact that you misused your first opportunity in purchasing this weapon, we cannot continue to supply the weapon. But that is in an ideal world, like I said, because I mean, looking at the money, the profit that people are making from weapons, nobody wants to consider that. But in an ideal society, we can say, okay, yes, we've made a mistake on that. But even if they say that, I think another question that may be following from that is that where do we place the bulk of responsibility? Is it going to be on those guys that misuse it, or because we made a mistake, we thought they are going to use the weapons well and they've misused it? I think these are very difficult questions to address at the moment, because, and going by the second question that is, I mean, it's almost linked here, because now we cannot really say there are examples of people that we can really highlight. Like, this is an example of companies that have been following that. But I am envisaging that is possible in the nearest future, particularly under the leadership of the current president of the United States, because I think it's one of the first presidents to stand up against the proliferation of weapons. It's one of the first presidents to do something like that. Maybe, but I think it's going to involve some kind of synergy between the government and leadership of the weapon system, of the arms industry, to be able to create something like this, because profit can corrupt. I mean, it's not only power that can corrupt, profit can corrupt too. And because of that, people may not want to consider the notion of liability or responsibility. And the fact that they've actually supplied the weapon and they don't know, they will think, since we've dropped the weapons with them, we don't need to follow up on how they're going to use it or how they're going to misuse it. But another point that's coming up in my mind is that it's going to be very difficult, because I think we cannot really have a totally just war, like a war that is complete. Even if angels are going to fight, there are going to be injustice. So on that note, I think that there'll be ground for excusing conditions. But like I said, like I answered, my answer to Philip, it's going to be the excusing conditions will be defined by the nature of the war. So it will be maybe contextually based. Again, I don't know, maybe I've answered your question by my ranting.
No, I appreciate your answer. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. One last very quick maybe question from Hussein, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. So Hussein, go ahead.
I would like to understand your concept of reparation better, and this will be linked to your answer that the condition will depend on the nature of the war. So I'm thinking of, for instance, something like a civil war where the unjust non-combatants might be numerous, right? Your idea of reparation in general seems to work on both restorative and retributive sides. You You advocate for restoration because you want some, even maybe financial payments to the people who were victims of the fight. And you also advocate for retribution because you think that certain people should be pointed at who will be responsible to take that financial burden, right? Yes. So your idea of reparation seems to incorporate both ideas of retribution and restoration. But when it comes to something like civil war, when the unjust non-combatants are numerous, retribution, I think, becomes almost impossible. What would you think about such situations?
Thank you so very much. I think that's one of the reasons why I said war can be very dynamic. You know, this is an example of war where we are thinking, oh, how do we consider this? But the point is, when we have lots of non-combatants in the case of civil war, I think you are very correct that retribution is going to be very difficult, because if you are going to create a ground for retribution, then majority of the non-combatants are going to be liable. And if majority of the non-combatants are liable, that itself is a problem. But if we place liability to harm and liability to reparation side by side, I think the issue of retribution is still feasible under the notion of liability to reparation, unlike in the context of liability to harm. So maybe even if you're having lots of civilians that are participating in war, in the context of civil war, they will always have leaders. They will always have leaders that are that are in charge of certain. I mean, even Taliban, they have their leaders. Al Qaeda, they have their leaders. And even civil war, like those may not be civil war, but even civil war, maybe in Nigeria, in Syria alone, they have people that are at the forefront of those wars, or people that instigated it. You can pinpoint them. Some of them, they are not hidden. They are very available. They may not be physically available, but people know them. So maybe the moral response here will be to focus on the leadership of those groups rather than trying to target en masse, because that is going to breach the, I mean, despite the fact that I'm going for the notion of the principle of liability to reparation, I still believe in the notion of the principle of non-combatant immunity, that combatants, they still deserve certain immunity. And rather than going for mass killing of civilians, then maybe we should just go for the leadership. And in fact, in some of the cases, for example, maybe I think it happened in Saudi Arabia and South Africa, sorry, and it happened in Zimbabwe. When you target the leadership, sometimes the whole structure of the rebel, whatever the group, is going to break somehow. So I think going for the leaders can be an alternative in that context.
It makes sense, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so very grateful for the questions. Thank you very much. God bless you.
Thank you very much for both the very interesting talk and also the great questions. And let us thank you, Dr. Omotoyinbo.